Welcome to the Khushwant Singh LitFest 2022, beamed to you from London. My name is F.S. Ijazuddin, and I'm based in Lahore in Pakistan. But my association with Khushwant Singh ji and his family, Rahul Singh, Mala, and also with Nilüfer Mauryan goes back over a number of years. In fact, my first contact with Khushwant Singh ji was in 1978 when I visited him in his flat in Sutan Singh Park. After that, every time I went to India, and particularly to New Delhi, it was to offer darshan to him and benefit from his advice and his benediction. This relationship remained until his death, and I was honored that I was asked by him and then later by his family to bring part of his ashes to his birthplace, Hadali, which is now in Pakistan, where we were able to immerse them both in the River Jairam, as well as to install them in a plaque at the school that he attended as a young boy in the 1920s. My association with the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, though, has been both at Kasoli and now, since COVID, via Zoom. And I'm delighted that we have this opportunity of presenting for you in the next 2 days the most remarkable array of talent and intellect that could be mustered on varied topics, and in which there'll be discussion on India's history in objects, on the Light of Asia, the translation by Sir Edwin Arnold, and then one on the Ukrainian Night. And this will be on the first day, and it'll be followed, as I'll explain to you later, with sessions on Sunday. The Khushwant Singh Literary Festival has taken Khushwant Singh and his books from Kasoli in the Indian Himalayas to the Docklands of London in the United Kingdom. The KSLF has proven that art and common heritage and our thoughts can travel in time across continents and, in fact, beyond centuries. It has also proved that there is a better world, a virtual world without borders, where crossing boundaries does not entail either passports or restricted visas. Rahul and Nilüfer had asked me to recite a poem which I'd composed some years ago, and I'm going to take the liberty of recalling it now. There was a time when time evoked tomorrows. Today, it speaks only of yesterdays. Where has the promise gone of fraternité sans frontières? Where are the tears we shed, the blood to irrigate our earth, once yours, now mine, once mine, now yours? Why must my only view of you be through the barrel of a gun? Why must I search for you in the debris of a divided sun? How long will this daily suicide last? While we have separate heavens there, will we have separate heavens there, or find ourselves sharing yet another common hell? The session, which will follow this, will be handled by Rachel Dwyer, and so, with your permission, I'll hand over to her. Rachel, it's yours.
Hello and welcome to the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival in London. I'm sorry again this year we're not meeting in person, but it's wonderful to be online, and perhaps it makes it even more accessible to those of you who can't come to London to join us today. But this festival once again celebrates the legacy of Khushwant Singh, author, scholar, journalist and iconoclast, discussing the values he stood for and addressing his concerns. It's in London because London is where he worked and studied, and it helped to shape many of his passions and concerns. These include closer ties between India and Pakistan, and London is one of the places where this happens, equal opportunities for women worldwide, and disseminating values of tolerance, democracy and compassion in a world today where we seem to need these more than ever. And one of the main themes underlying the festival is that of ecology, a constant love of his and about which he wrote several books. So today, this festival, linked very closely to the subcontinent, is entirely organised by volunteers, and everybody comes together to do this as a labour of love. I think I'd just like to say a little bit more about the idea of ecology underlying the festival, and how much Kushwant talked about these in his writings, whether his literary writings, such as The Train to Pakistan, with its famously evocative passages about the monsoon, a book that many people, of course, will know him for as something of a classic, as well as being made into a film. But he also wrote books about trees, including one called Trees of Delhi. So in honour of him, every year, for every speaker, trees are planted at Kasauli, at Kasauli where he lived. Trees have been planted for him. But this year from the festival, they're called Trees for Tigers because they're being planted in the Sundarban National Park in West Bengal. So I think this theme of ecology underlies much of the way that people look at India and South Asia, often without always realizing that that's what they're doing. And, this morning I looked and saw the temperatures in parts of Western India in the high 40s. I think that's a reminder to us that we ought to be thinking about this more than ever. Well, today I'm delighted to introduce two very old and very special friends of mine who are going to be talking about a wonderful new book about India. I'll start off by introducing the discussant, who is Dr. Zaria Masani. Zaria is a well-known figure. He often takes a stand against popular views of India today, always defending his corner with great humour and vigour and perhaps courage, one might say, too. A student, he took his doctorate at Oxford and since then has written many books, including about figures such as Macaulay. He's currently working on another book on Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India. And he's also written a biography of Indira Gandhi. He's written Indian Tales of the Raj and India from Raj to Rajiv with Mark Tully. I also feel I know a great deal more about Zaria than just from meeting him because I've read his memoir, All Is Said, about his relations with his fabulous parents, great characters, and of course his father, Minu Masani, now seen as a very important figure in the history of Indian politics. And he's talking to Richard Blurton. Richard worked for many years at the British Museum. He joined in 1986 and he retired 4 years ago as the head of the South and Southeast Asia section. Richard, I'm very grateful to you for years of taking my first year undergraduate students around the museum. And, many of them said they'd never been to a museum before, but having been, they now felt it was a space they could return to and feel at home in. So that was really a great achievement. Richard has worked on many areas as an archaeologist as well, from North Africa to Afghanistan, and in southern India worked with Dr. George Michel, another SOAS alumnus. And he's arranged many exhibitions at the British Museum over the years, as well as in India itself. I think really Richard's book collection is well known. His books on Assam, Bengal, Burma, and Hindu art are still very much used and read today. While at the museum, really dealing not just with the existing collections and bringing them up to date, but acquiring new works, paintings by Rabindranath Tagore, prints by Krishna Reddy, modern textiles, photographs and large-scale sculpture by Mrinalini Mukherjee, or Dilu, as we know her better. And in retirement, he seems to be, like Zaria, keeping us all ashamed of our own lack of productivity. You now have a new book, a wonderful book, which I was lucky to see some previews of, India, A History Through Objects, which is appearing next month, I believe. It's about the works of the British Museum, which he knows so well. And to have them brought to life in this book by somebody who knows these objects almost as everyday life, I think really gives it some warmth. So let me hand over to Zaria to introduce the talk and Richard's new book. Thank you.
Richard, very nice to be speaking to you about this wonderful book, which is extremely ambitious because you really start 1,000,000 years BC and bring it up to the present. And you not only focus on the wonderful collections of the British Museum, but you have a lot of live art from India, from sites that you have visited and others. Could I ask you to kick off whether you were inspired in any way by Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 500 Objects?
Well, you're right to invoke Neil's work at the museum. His famous title, A History of the World in 100 Objects, was a project during the time I was in harness at the museum, and of course it was enormously influential. And in a sense, it has definitely spawned a whole load of further or it spawned an idea that this is how you can look at history, not just in terms of texts and memory, but also you can write history through objects. This is a highly revealing way of considering the writing of history. Many insights can be gained from the physical remains of the past, both remotely. You mentioned 1,000,000 years ago. In fact, my book begins actually with 1.5 million years ago, a single stone axe from southern India, and indeed comes right up to the present day.
May I interrupt you there to suggest?
Please.
Can you show us this wonderful axe?
Yes. It's the,
Oh,
here is the axe. It's from a site called, well, it's either from Atirampakam or from Pallavaram, which are two sites just outside Chennai. They were investigated in the 1850s by the great British geologist Bruce Foote, who had been who'd become aware of the work that was being done in France on early Stone Age accomplishments in the remote past, and he was able to recognize that this was indeed a man-made tool, work that's since been done there by the Sharma Heritage Center. Further excavations there have shown through the use of paleomagnetic dating methods that these axes are of extreme antiquity, and they're the oldest thing from the subcontinent in the British Museum collection. There's a much greater collection of them, I should add, in the museum in Chennai, and it will be a wonderful opportunity for one of my colleagues in the future to continue working on the links between these different parts of the collection.
Now, moving on, possibly almost 500,000 years or more, to the rather controversial Indus Valley civilization, which India and Pakistan fight for ownership of, but which certainly has no direct connection with anything that came later. What do your objects tell us about the Indus Valley civilization? Now, this particular necklace is a Roman one made out of imports from Indus
no.
Valley.
No, sorry. This necklace is, I put it in especially because it's from the royal tombs at Ur. So it's from southern Iraq, found in southern Iraq, and it's fascinating for the light it throws on the Indus settlements because of the materials it uses. These tubular carnelian beads, these long, thin carnelian beads, are a product, or were a product of Indus craftsmen. And the blue beads, of course, are lapis lazuli. And lapis only comes from northeastern Afghanistan. So
Yes.
the appearance of these in an early 3rd millennium BC royal tomb in southern Iraq tells us something about the trading links, the contacts, the crossing borders, if you like, of these early inhabitants of the Indus Valley. As you quite rightly mentioned, the Indus Valley citizens had no concerns with boundaries of the sort that we struggle with today, and their sites are found throughout the Indus Valley, but also into northwestern India, in the modern states of Gujarat and Haryana and Punjab. So it's a very, very wide range. Involved in trade.
Could we see some of the seals, which I know you have, which are illustrated in your book?
Yeah, these are.
And what I would like you to address is this rather controversial question of who the Indus Valley belongs to, because it doesn't seem to have had any direct connection with later Aryan settlements. So, have you been able to find any connections?
Well, archaeologically, there is continuity between the great settlements, large settlements like Kalibangan and Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and Lothal also. There is some connection, but it's not in terms of grandeur or of great urban civilization. It appears, none of this can be absolute yet, but it appears that the end of the Indus civilization was not cataclysmic, was not due to some intense, sudden invasion. There is no evidence of that. There is evidence of slow, gradual decline. And it seems clear that the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age settlements that we find in Western India in the succeeding periods do actually continue the legacy of the Indus civilization, but without its huge sophistication. So there is no continuity of the use of these stamp seals, for instance. And there is no continuity in terms of huge brick buildings. So it's a mixed picture, and like so many of these controversial subjects, it is neither one thing nor the other. Could I just point out, while we've got these seals up on the screen, I chose this one especially because, as you can see, it depicts a rhinoceros. Now, there haven't been rhinoceroses in the Indus Valley for a very, very long time, millennia. Other seals show elephants, and similarly, they haven't been seen in northwestern subcontinent for a very long time. And it seems clear, bearing in mind especially what Rachel was saying earlier, that there has been climate change in this zone. Some people have suggested that the huge number of brick buildings that were made in the Indus cities, to fire bricks, you have to have a large amount of wood, you have to cut down a lot of forests. If that is the case, you may well get climate change. And if you look at these depictions of animal life at that time, you can only come to that conclusion. So
now I'm going to fast forward us a bit to a few 100,000 years, because I'm very conscious of the enormous ground we need to cover.
Yeah.
Fascinating though each aspect is.
Just before
So
we go on that image, can I just point out that long dice? That it's for gaming. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the playing and throwing of dice has a long tradition in India, with many depictions and many descriptions in the epics. Anyway, onwards.
What I'd like to ask you is another controversial question, which is the Aryan or Aryan, if we use the Indian pronunciation, settlements in India, which are present Hindutva brigade question, because everything is indigenous. Have you found evidence archaeologically? I know there's plenty of genetic evidence that there were major invasions from the Indo-Aryan, Indo-European areas moving across North India southwards.
Well, this is, of course, as you rightly say, a controversial subject, but I'm looking solely at the physical evidence, the things that you can hold in your hand, the things that you can look at. There is no absolute connection between objects and any early Indo-Aryan communities. We can't make that connection. Obviously, we have the texts, the Vedas, and especially the earliest of those, the Rig Veda, which describe the early presence of those people in what's probably the Western Punjab, and then the later Vedas describe probably what's the Eastern Punjab. But there are no objects that one can categorically say this ceramic, this item of metal or whatever was made by or used by speakers of a certain language. This is an area of huge pitfalls, and it's very important to remember that unless you have an inscription, there is no way of making a connection between what people speak and what they made.
Understood. Now, moving on a bit to the what many people regard as the acme of Indian, certainly ancient Indian civilization, was the Mauryan period, very much marked by these sculptures you're going to show us from Amravati, these which are wonderfully housed in the British Museum, thanks to a British civil servant, Eliot, who excavated them, discovered them, brought them to Madras, where many of them still are. So these so-called Eliot marbles or Amravati marbles, which really occupy a wonderful room in the British Museum. Can you tell us what they actually illustrate in terms of the wonderful Mauryan period?
Yes. These sculptures on the screen at present, there's an early one, probably from about 100 BC. These sculptures all come from the Buddhist stupa, the domed structure, typical Buddhist structure at Amravati on the southeastern coast, on the Andhra coast of India. The earliest sculptures there date probably to about 200 BC, so we're in the zone of the very earliest surviving sculptures in stone found anywhere in India, and the latest ones are probably 8th or 9th century AD, so you have a hugely long period of Buddhist activity at this site in southern India. You mentioned quite correctly Eliot, who was there stationed in Guntur district in Andhra, southern Andhra, in the 1850s, but he also had a famous and particularly Scottish predecessor who was Major General Colin Mackenzie. Now, Mackenzie was the first Surveyor General of India, and he was the first person to visit Amaravati and to draw anything of the ancient stupa. He visited it briefly in 1797, when he found that a local zamindar was raiding the stupa, using it as a quarry for his new palace, and many of the blocks were actually, I mean, it's fine limestone, were being burnt to produce mortar. So you know, the early history of the discovery and understanding of the great stupa at Amaravati is troubled, frankly. Later, Mackenzie came back and spent a long time recording what he saw there, but by that time a tank had been built in the top of the dome of the stupa, and so you know, our knowledge today of the upper part of the stupa is very limited. What we do have, though, is information about the lower part of the dome, and then the walkway all the way around it, the Pradakshinapattha, the zone where pilgrims and monks would circumambulate the stupa, honoring the relic that was held within it. And all of these elements were magnificently carved. And early on, there are stories from the life of the Buddha, stories from the Jatakas, but with no depiction of the Buddha image himself, because in early
Buddhism, could we see any other images?
See whether, what's the next one? Here we are. Yes, well done. This one on the left side, divided into 4 different scenes, actually shows the birth of the Buddha. In the top right-hand corner, we see a female figure, that's Queen Maya, dreaming, and she dreamt, of course, that a white elephant would enter her side, and she would bear a male child, a prince. The panel to the left shows the interpretation of the dream. The one at bottom right, Queen Maya hanging onto the tree in the Lumbini Park. This is the birth of the Buddha, and the one on the bottom left is the presentation of the child Buddha to the family deity. Now, I don't know that we can see clearly at this point, but actually the birth of the Buddha, bottom right, and the presentation, bottom left, both have figures carrying cloth. On that cloth are footprints which mark the presence of the Buddha child. The Buddha is not depicted corporeally. Later, of course, he is, and this injunction on showing the actual body disappears. The other image on this screen shows an early depiction of the stupa. So it's domed, and it has a gallery all the way around the base for the Pradakshinapattha, and it's guarded by a magnificent multi-headed Naga king, and the top of the dome is an explosion of protective umbrellas.
Richard, what the Elliott marbles very much demonstrated to me when I first visited the British Museum way back in the 1960s was the extent to which India's classical heritage had been rediscovered by British Orientalists and archaeologists. And of course, one here has to hear mention the wonderful Sir William Jones and James Princeton, thanks to whom the Brahmese script was deciphered, which is why we could read Ashoka's edicts. So I think, does this really kind of illustrate one of the themes of this Litfest, crossing borders, in the way that British Orientalists, contrary to Edward Said's strictures, actually rediscovered those classical heritage for us, and crossed cultural borders which were very important.
Those names that you mention are indeed heroes for anyone who is interested in the ancient history of India. You're right. And another figure whom we might also mention here, who was of immense importance, was Alexander Cunningham. the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey. He spent many years traveling throughout India at a time, in the mid-19th century, when travel was much less easy than it is today, and recording historical and archaeological sites. His work at Bodh Gaya especially but not only there, is of huge importance still today, and his records of the temple at Bodh Gaya both before, during, and after its restoration are of immense importance to us today in understanding that major site in Bihar.
Yeah. Now, Richard, just thinking a little ahead from the Mauryan period, we have the Kushans, we have the Bactrian rulers of the area called Gandhara. How do these illustrate the kind of open borders that existed both culturally and politically at the time?
That's important, and I'm going to show some images just in a moment. But before we leave Amaravati, and bearing in mind the theme of our discussion, I just want to mention that Amaravati was one of the most important centers for the diffusion of Buddhism out of India and into Southeast Asia. And the name Amaravati is still remembered in Thailand, for instance. There's no memory of the actual site, but it is remembered as a place of great religious importance, just as it is also in the Tibetan tradition. And it's no surprise that in recent years, the Dalai Lama has presented the Kalachakra Tantra at Amaravati, because in the Tibetan tradition, that teaching is connected with that place. Now, as you mentioned, on to Gandhara, and of course, this is a fascinating and intriguing period in South Asian cultural history. It's a time when, as you mentioned, the southwest is the northwest is open to Iran, to the Hellenistic and the Roman worlds, and also to Bactria. In the in the 1st century AD, we know that Bactrian nomads entered into northwestern India. We know them today as the Kushans, and they set up both at what's today Kabul and also in Peshawar, but also in Mathura, south of Delhi. So a very wide spanning empire, mostly Buddhist, though of course Mathura had many Jain shrines, and a time that was extremely open to ideas coming in from outside. So the two images that you see on the screen here, obviously the one on the left is the Buddha, the standing Buddha, and the one on the right is a Bodhisattva. It's Maitreya, but of course they appear, first of all, in bodily form, whereas previously the Buddha had not been shown as a human living being. But perhaps more importantly, they are shown as wearing costume that would not have been out of place further west, possibly even as far as the Hellenistic worlds of Syria and Egypt. So the notion of presenting divine figures in this absolutely human form, recognizably, unquestionably human, and shown wearing classical Roman garb, as it were. These are ideas that come in from the West, along with all sorts of other ideas on iconography and coinage and many other ideas of civilization ideas. Script, of course, and different scripts, and the use of scripts like Koroshti, for instance, which are probably based on Aramaic. So an important, a very important period.
Sticking with Mathura for a minute,
Yeah.
Mathura also became very much a center of Brahmanical Hindu art under the Gupta.
A little later, yeah, that's right.
Which came almost sort of coterminous with Gandhara. How far was there a struggle between Buddhism and Hinduism during this period, with Hinduism coming out on top and Buddhism virtually disappearing from India?
Well, that's a process that took a very long time, and it does depend, where you are in India. So, we know, for instance, that Buddhism in Orissa survived into the Mughal period. So, it's a very, very long process. But you're right, of course, under the Gupta kings. Sorry, let's move the images on. I put this one up because, of course, it there is shown as Hercules, so he's wearing the skin of the Nemean lion. But let's move away from Gandhara and to the further survivals of Oopsie. We'll need to come back to some of these, perhaps. Right. Now let's look at some of this material, and this is obviously a sculpture of Varaha, the boar-headed incarnation of Vishnu rescuing the earth goddess from the ocean demon. In a late Gupta, very confident, very strong medium. It's undoubtedly true that at the time of the Gupta kings in the 4th, 5th centuries AD, royal patronage, or royal personal patronage, perhaps we should say, is much more closely connected with the cults of early Hinduism, and many of them producing sculpture in Mathura stone, such as this one here of Varaha. That it doesn't mean, though, that the Gupta kings and indeed their successors didn't support and patronize Buddhist artists as well. That undoubtedly continued, and the two seem to have rubbed along together without great conflict. I wouldn't describe it as a time of a conflict other than conflict in words. And we certainly know that further south in what's now Tamil Nadu, there were the early Shaivite saints, for instance, in the 7th, 8th centuries AD, people like Appar and Sambanda and so on. These saints did inveigh against the Buddhists, but it's verbally rather. We don't think that there's no real record of outright hostility and armed conflict. No, that's not the story.
Now you're going to show us a couple of images from Bodh Gaya, aren't you? And my impression was that Bodh Gaya was very much rediscovered again by British archaeologists.
Actually, I don't have any Bodh Gaya images, I don't think, but they're certainly in the book I described.
Yes.
That.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. The history of, it's a very intriguing story. The history of Buddhism as an Indian religion had practically disappeared in India itself. Knowledge of that had really disappeared. And for instance, when Mackenzie first went to Amaravati, he thought he'd found, on the very first visit, he thought he'd found a Jain shrine. Because Buddhism wasn't something that he or any of his peers encountered in India. and so it wasn't properly understood that Buddhism was originally an Indian religion, and that it then spread outside the subcontinent and indeed declined and was eventually extinguished in the subcontinent. So the earliest understanding of Bodh Gaya, where of course the temple was in the control of Vaishnav Mat there in Bodh Gaya, the initial understanding of it was very confused, and it was people like Cunningham, whom I mentioned earlier, who began to unpick the story, and it took a long time. You still have people like Waddell, several generations later, still looking to better understand the sites connected with the life of the Buddha. So it's a long story of recovery.
Now, something I know you're keen to talk about, which also spread rather like Buddhism, way beyond India's borders, is India's textiles.
Yes.
And you have a couple of images of those, and
Yes.
you're going to tell us how transnational they were.
Yes, and thank you, Zara. This is really a subject that intrigues me greatly and which is well represented in the book. The image that you see on the screen at present, this rather sort of moth-eaten looking scrap, is actually probably the earliest surviving example we have today of a woven cotton Indian textile. It's basically, it's a dari in today's terminology. But these scraps, there are this one and 4 or 5 other scraps, were found by Sir Aurel Stein, the great Hungarian, though later British naturalized explorer, who opened up many of the ancient histories of the Taklamakan, the oasis cities of Western China. This fragment comes from Nia on the southern route, and it was found in deposits that can be dated between the 1st and the 3rd century AD. So, I mean, that's why I'm showing it. It's unremarkable to look at, but it's incredibly important because it's so early.
Now, let's. I'm going to have to move on a bit. I'm just conscious of our hour. Can we go back to the Chola kings? Because there was this immense spread of Hinduism and Hindu art across Southeast Asia, which presumably comes from the Cholas.
Well,
maybe you have. Do you have your wonderful Nataraj image?
Yes, I do.
Which is the cover of your book.
Indeed, yes. Before we leave this screen, though, the one on the left is an export from southern India to the Celebes, Sulawesi in Southeast Asia. So carrying on your mention of Southeast Asia, let's go and look at some of these magnificent Chola sculptures. Here. This great image, which if you go to the British Museum Gallery today, you will see this as you walk into the space where the South Asian collections are displayed. The Chola kings were patrons of bronze casters whose work probably has never been surpassed, anyway, in India, and certainly in my opinion. They were incredibly skilled in the manipulation and use of molten bronze. And these great images here, and I think we have another couple here, yes, are wonderful examples of their craft.
John Singh Krishna.
It's not actually, it's Sambandha. It, you're right, very similar to the child Krishna, but actually this pointed finger upwards identifies him as the Saint Sambandha, but very, very similar to Dancing Krishna. And the other one, of course, a standard, a Shaiva standard for carrying in processions. And knowledge of how to produce such magnificent bronze sculpture was undoubtedly part of the coincidental inheritance of the Chola presence both in Sri Lanka and indeed in Southeast Asia. Though, having said that, places like, well, certainly Java had been important centers of contact between India and Southeast Asia for many centuries before the Cholas. So the Chola link with zones such as the kingdom of Srivijaya comes at the end of a long period of contact. So, Borobudur, for instance, the great Buddhist shrine on Java, is a sort of three-dimensional mandala, of course, and the mandala idea is originally Indian, but no one in India had ever thought to build one on that scale. So it's a magnificent development of an originally Indian idea. The Chola presence, though, comes a little bit later.
Now, I'm going to move us on. I think we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move us on to Persianist culture.
Yeah.
And I really want to pose the question again. It's become politically controversial whether this was part of the so-called Hindu wound, which was a millennium of foreign rule, and whether the Muslim and Persianist rulers from the 11th century onwards should be regarded as imperial occupiers, or were actually, no, which they certainly are by the Hindutva brigade, or whether they were well integrated into Indian society and produced what in many respects was a very creative fusion of Central Asian, Persian influences with the preceding Hindu and Buddhist ones.
Well, I would certainly agree with your second definition. I don't think there's any serious doubt about that, frankly. And the fact that, of course, if you mention anywhere in the world today, Indian architecture, the first building that people think of course, is the Taj. Not everyone, you may not all agree, but that is the case. I think to disown the many hundreds of years of Mughal and Islamic contact with India is to cut off your nose to spite your face. And of course, many of those emperors and rulers in the pre-Mughal period, as well as in the Mughal period, were keen not only to be imperial powers, but also to understand and to contribute to the culture of their subjects. So in my book, for instance, I have a section on the both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and both of these great texts, of course, were translated into Persian during the reign of Akbar, and they were that was specifically so that the courtiers, the Mughal courtiers, could understand these great epics and therefore have access to the culture of their subjects. And this is just one small example, but it's an important example. Some people, of course, have questioned the degree to which Aurangzeb wished to be wish to meld.
Yes, well, you've got your illustration. Your illustration here has Jahangir weighing his son Shah Jahan, presumably,
It is
in rather Hindu fashion.
indeed.
Was there a change, do you think, from Jahangir down to Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, who were much more Islamist in their approach than Akbar and Jahangir had been?
Well, Akbar is certainly, frequently held up as a paragon. It's true, but I don't agree with the notion that it's downhill all the way thereafter, and I do believe that the melding of cultural influences was so great by that time that it would be impossible to unpick it. And I think the notion that it all has to be abandoned or negated or done away with or dismissed, all those astonishing links and achievements, that's for the birds, in my opinion.
I suppose one has to acknowledge the fact that certainly in the early Muslim invasions, there was a huge amount of destruction of Hindu temples, Hindu art. One only has to look at the number of statues in temples that have been defaced to see that.
Of course, invasions and war do produce casualties. Of course, I would, one would be foolish to assume otherwise. In
this case, I think there is a strong Islamic belief in not representing people and certainly not their faces. So the defacement was very much an Islamist phenomenon, which I think perhaps we need to recognize.
Of course, there are many examples of that, but I don't think I have great trouble in looking back on the past and trying to interpret it with today's standards. I think much better to get on and understand it all within the common context. I'm very queasy about attaching blame in retrospect.
Now, shall we move on to another sort of foreign influence, which is often regarded as being intrusive, but in many ways also affected the way that Indian culture developed, and not least our sort of contemporary preoccupations. And I'm talking about European influences, starting with the Portuguese and later with the French and the British, and remaining to this day with our sort of rather globalized contemporary art. So perhaps we should, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Should we talk about the modern period and the colonial impact, which produced in some ways very creative art, like the Company School of Painting, which rescued Mughal art from decline and breathed new life into it?
Well, certainly this type of painting, which it's a sort of omnium gatherum term, company painting, but painting for the painting by Indian artists for European, often British patrons, is very attractive and very interesting, and tells us a lot about the history of the period. In the British Museum, we have a fine collection of this material, and I'm just going to show two examples here. One of which, this one here, shows a group of Sikh recruits, probably about 1820 in Delhi, and the next one, which I think shows, yes, that's right, two images, one of which, the one on the left side, shows Shiva and Parvati and is from southern India, and and is of great interest because it also shows them wearing these spectacular textiles, which are of course such a lure to the British and French in the south. And the other image, which shows a botanical sample, it's from the botanical garden at Shibpur in Calcutta, and shows the clerodendron plant. All three of these show the way in which Indian artists with extraordinary skill managed to change their way of depict the way they produced a picture and produce things that were attractive to their new European patrons. This first one, I think, is particularly interesting because it's connected with the painter who produced the Fraser paintings, Fraser album paintings in Delhi, and it comes with a list of the names of the individual characters. Here we see something that is much more photorealistic, I suppose you would say. It's much less concerned with vibrant design, with sort of the manipulation of color. It's much more graded, and it's moved away completely from the style of painting that we know either from the Mughal court or from the early Pahari courts up in the northern Punjab. So it is a departure for Indian painting and for Indian depictions of the world around them, but it's one that was incredibly productive. And in some of these paintings, like this one of the clerodendron, is part of the whole scientific examination of both the natural and the geological and geographical world in which the British officers found themselves. This painting was probably commissioned by Roxburgh, the second, I think, or was it the first, superintendent of the garden at Shibpur in Calcutta. So part of that huge scientific project.
So in a way, what we're seeing is that the European influence on Indian art, like the Mughal, was quite positive in many respects. I mean, we got perspective, we got a certain degree of naturalism, and you're going to show us here a couple of silver objects made, I think, by Om Morasia in Kutch.
Yes. Actually, the one on the left was not made by Om, but is very typical of this type of vessel. It's a sporting trophy and has an inscription inside it, whereas the one on the right is indeed from Omaisi Mauji's studio. It's a drawing of a vessel made to commission by probably by a British patron, but there were plenty of Indian patrons also of Omaisi Mauji, who lived in Kutch. His great period of productivity was in the late, probably the last decade of the 19th century and the 20th century up until the First War. The First War more or less killed his popularity, but this teapot, of course, is a very typical product of his workshop. It has his mark on the base. It's hugely elaborate and densely covered in decoration. And of course, you can imagine how very, very popular this sort of image would have been in the late 19th century, but also how completely unpopular it would have been by the 1920s. You know, you couldn't get much further than the Bauhaus than this.
Well, I'm proud to say I have an Om Morasia box behind me.
Oh, good for you. Well done, Zuria.
Which is very pretty with tigers engraved on it. So, coming more to the contemporary period, Richard,
Yeah.
which I know you're keen to talk about, and I think we only have a few minutes left. Would you like to sort of talk a little about contemporary art and why you think it's important to keep that in view?
Oh, well, I think it's very important to keep it in view because, you know, to understand the Indian world, which is our attempt at the British Museum, then we need to understand what's going on today. And as I've mentioned earlier, I think that objects, items that you can hold in your hand, that you can interrogate yourself, these are a hugely productive way of doing it. Photography, of course, has been one of the very important elements in 19th and 20th century, and indeed 21st century South Asian imagining of the world. This is by Lionel Wendt, the Sri Lankan burgher artist, and this is a much more recent work by the current Pakistani artist Bani Abadi, who uses photography to produce her images. And here, it's part of a series. She's placed figures in the street at a certain time of day, and it's the time of the year and the time of the day when most people in Karachi will be breaking their fast after Ramadan. So this woman is clearly not a Muslim. She's wearing a sari. She is indeed a Hindu a member of the community in Karachi. Others in the series show Parsis and Christians. So this is an intriguing way of using photography to comment on today's society.
Richard, I think we have 2 or 3 minutes left. If you want,
can I just mention these two paintings here? This is Binod Bihari Mukherjee, and this is Abanindranath Tagore. Both of them were hugely influenced and travelled in the Far East with Tagore. So Chinese and Japanese paintings were enormously influential for them. And then finally, I just want to show a few of the modern items in the BM collection, which comprise both political materials, such as this poster from Pakistan with Richard Nixon, Bhutto and Kosygin visible there in the bottom of the image, and then finally the last image, the sculpture that you mentioned earlier, Zaria, by Mrinalini Mukherjee. Thank you.
Wonderful. So it's a real tour d'horizon, and I can vouch for the fact that the illustrations we haven't seen are even, well, quite as mouth-watering as the ones we have seen. And so I think once the book is out, it will be hugely enjoyable for anyone interested in South Asian art. It's clearly been a labor of love, and most of your life has been spent researching the material which appears in it. So highly recommended. I'm going to be reviewing it for Open Magazine and look forward to reading it when it's fully out. Thank you very much, Richard. I think we will now hand back to Rachel.
Thank you. Well, I mean, that was a wonderful discussion, Richard, and just the breadth of the book is extraordinary. You know, I mean, it was just fascinating. Now, I'm not going to ask you one of those questions like, should the British Museum return its treasures? I think it might blow its top if I did. So I won't ask you such a very silly question, I think. But what I'd really like to know is, which is your favourite of all those objects? That's a hard question. There always is a favourite.
Oh gosh, I don't know. Let's say Binod Bihari Mukherjee, the painting right towards the end. Well, I think if that was here in my study, it would be such a calming and beautiful influence. And the fact that it was produced by an artist who worked with Tagore and traveled with him. I mean, Tagore, I think, is such an astonishing character, much of which we still don't fully understand. I think within the parameters of today's discussion, the fact that he described himself as a product of a Hindu, a Muslim, and a British culture, this tells us a lot about where we should be aiming for.
Yes, I do think Tagore is one of those characters who's just very, very hard for us to really get any grip on his real lasting significance and his importance.
Especially, I think, if you don't speak Bengali. But if you do, then here is the picture. Then, I think there are huge riches to be found. And the fact that scholars in recent years have been reevaluating his poetry, moving away from all that Yeats-influenced language that you see in Gitanjali, and considering his educationist work, his rural work, his journalism, his novels, he was such an extraordinary character.
Zaria, would you like to say anything?
Well, I think I think I've said enough, but I'm conscious of the time because we were meant to keep within an hour, weren't we?
We were. I just wondered if you wanted to have a quick mention of Tagore.
No, I will leave Richard to with the admiration for him. I have to admit he's not one of my favorite authors, and I'm not a great fan of his school of painting. But tastes. That's the good thing about it. The tastes can differ.
Well, I'm learning some Bengali in my retirement, so look forward
to you. Well done.
Finally. So let's hope I can catch up with it. But Richard, this book is wonderful. I'm looking forward to seeing, the printed edition with all the drawings and the images shown clearly. And congratulations. It's a great book one can only produce when one has worked so closely with the objects themselves over so many years. I mean, daunting from,
impossible. Frankly, impossible. Certain things I managed to write practically in my sleep. Other things I had to take weeks to, produce 2 sentences. So I've learned a great deal, and it's been like a sort of brain dump for me in my retirement from the museum. Knowledge gained over 32 years or so. Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. And look forward to reading your review of it soon, Zaria. So many thanks to our 2 wonderful speakers today. I think, that was a discussion that people are really going to listen to carefully, and then get the book, go to the museum. Now we can go back again. And I think this would have been something which would have been lovely to have Kushwant's own inputs into what he thought were the objects that defined India. Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, cheerio.
Welcome to the second session of the Kushwant Singh Lit Fest. And this session is going to feature Mr. Jairam Ramesh. He's an Indian economist, historian, and politician belonging to the Indian National Congress. He's a member of parliament representing Karnataka state in the Rajya Sabha. He belongs to that rare breed of politicians who write not about themselves, about others. In his case, about Rameshji's work is on Sir Edmund Arnold's epic in 1879 and has remained relevant and in vogue ever since. Rameshji draws on India's literary, cultural, political, and social history to explain the poem in its context, and also provides an unusual dimension on the life of Sir Edwin Arnold, the famous British poet steeped in Sanskrit literature. This session will be conducted as a conversation with Mick Brown, a famous journalist who wrote for the Sunday Times as well as the Daily Telegraph, and whose book, fascinating title, is called Music for the Spiritual Tourist. And it combines his interest in both music and spirituality. Over to you, Mick.
Thank you so much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here today. By here, I mean I'm sitting in the offices of the Daily Telegraph because we're doing this by the wonders of the internet. But it's an enormous pleasure to be talking to Mr. Ramesh. I feel particularly pleased to be having a conversation with you, Jairam, if I may call you Jairam. I'm very excited by Sir Edwin Arnold because, as far as I know, he's the only editor of the Daily Telegraph ever to write an epic poem of the life of the Buddha, which has sold 1 million copies around the world. I think I can safely say no other editor of the Daily Telegraph has ever done that. And as a journalist for the Telegraph, that makes me feel proud by association. But this is a simply splendid, extraordinarily interesting, extraordinarily enlightening, a word which of course should be used in the context of Buddhism, extraordinarily enlightening book. And I congratulate you on it. I found it absorbing, fascinating, and just a brilliant read. It also, I think, remedies something, which is that Sir Edwin Arnold, who to my mind is one of the great Victorians, has been overlooked, really. And your book sets out to rectify that and to remedy that, which I think it does, and really brings this very eminent Victorian back into everybody's imagination, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. So what I'm really interested to know is what first alerted you to this poem, and what first alerted you to Sir Edwin Arnold, and why did you want to write a book about it?
Well, Mick, every Indian has Buddha in his or her DNA, if not
Right.
Buddhism. Buddha is very much part of our lives. We are taught about Buddha in school. Buddha is all over us, Buddhist icons, iconography, Buddhist paintings, Buddhist statues. So Buddha is very much part of Indian life, as I'm sure it's part of life in other parts of the subcontinent like Sri Lanka and Nepal, particularly. And I read this poem when I was 14 years old or 15 years old, and it just remained with me. But over the years, as I'm not a Buddhist in the ritualistic or the religious sense of the term, but I'm fascinated and captivated by two particular figures in Indian history, Buddha and Ashoka, who did much to propagate Buddhism as a creed. And as I kept, reading about Buddhism and the spread of Buddhism, it just struck me how extraordinarily influential Edwin Arnold's poem of 1879 was in making the personality of the Buddha, if not Buddhism per se, the personality of the Buddha, so very popular, not only in England and Europe, not only in America, but also in Asia, including the subcontinent. And then I discovered this fascinating exchange between Winston Churchill and Jawaharlal Nehru, which takes place in 1955. And Churchill is reminding Nehru about the light of Asia. So I was just struck by how important this poem was from a cultural and literary point of view. But as I studied it more, I found its influence from a social point of view equally important. So on the one side, Mick, you have the literary and cultural impact of this poem. But more profoundly, this poem, in its translations into many Indian languages, made Buddha the symbol of social transformation. The anti-caste movement in India took Buddha as the icon of social protest. And
Mhm.
all of them derived their image of Buddha and Buddha's life from the light of Asia, read not in English, but in Tamil, in Hindi, in Malayalam, in Telugu, and various Indian languages.
Yeah,
So
this is
it's a very fascinating story of a poem.
It's an extraordinary story, and I wasn't aware at all. Forgive me I wasn't aware at all of, as you say, the social implications, particularly in the subcontinent of this.
I would just say that the English had a literary impact, the English poem in English, but its social impact came through its multiple translations.
Right. There's two things I want to ask you before we get into that, which I do want to discuss. First of all, you say you read this poem when you were 14 years of age. Under what circumstances? Was this on the school curriculum or something, or did you?
No. It was a poem that my father had in his bookshelf. I grew up in a Hindu family, but a very ecumenical and a very liberal Hindu family, and we had books on Buddha, we had books on the Jains. We had books on Christianity, in my father's bookshelf. I went to a convent school,
Right.
so, I belong to that generation of Indians. So,
Yes.
I mean, I read it. It didn't strike me, but it remained with me. What I wish to say,
Yeah. First of all, could you tell our audience something about the man, Sir Edwin Arnold himself? Because to me, he's a very profoundly interesting man. In many ways, typical of his generation, typical of his era, but in other ways, completely atypical of his era.
Yeah.
Give us some idea of who Sir Edwin Arnold was.
Well, Mick, I depart company from my good friend and party colleague and fellow MP, Shashi Tharoor, who paints the Victorian era as an era of high imperialism, of people, who had nothing better to do, thought of nothing except subjugating a colonial people. I think the Victorian period also had a large number of personalities who, while they were committed to British rule in India, were equally captivated and fascinated by India's, and when I say India, I mean the subcontinent's cultural and spiritual and literary legacy. So you have the rediscovery of Buddhism going on. You have the epigraphical rediscovery. You have the archaeological rediscovery. You have the literary rediscovery, and there are a large number of people, Mick. And I believe that I don't think that Edwin Arnold wrote this poem sitting down in his cottage in Kent, saying, now, how do I justify Queen Victoria's rule in India? And I will produce this poem on the Buddha. So you have people like James Prinsep, you have people like Alexander Cunningham, you have people like Max Muller, you have, all these are Victorians who believe in Britain's manifest destiny in India. But at the same time, they are people who are learning Sanskrit, who are learning Indian languages, who are translating the ancient Indian literary texts. Edwin Arnold translated the Mahabharata, he translated the Bhagavad Gita, he translated many, very many major Indian works. And therefore, Edwin Arnold is a very, very unusual figure. He comes to India in 1857 as the mutiny, is winding down. The First War of Independence, as we like to call it, and the Great Mutiny, as you like to call it. He came to
the War of Independence. Come on.
He came to India. He spent 2.5 years in India as principal of a college, taught himself, learned Sanskrit, learned Marathi, started, this lifelong love affair with Indian literary classics. And of course, for 25 years, he was the leader writer of your newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, writing thundering articles, against the Russians. He was a great supporter of the Turks against the Russians. He wrote great, a lot of articles he wrote on Britain's role in the world, which today might sound to be an apology for British imperialism, but in the context of the times, I would say he was a liberal imperialist. He was, he was not a hardcore imperialist, but he was an imperialist who taught himself multiple languages, who was very, very sensitive to, local cultures. Sri Lanka, Ceylon. He went to Ceylon, of course. Even, of course, he had, he was very close to India. He became, for the last 20 years of his life, married a Japanese and became a great advocate of an Anglo-Japanese alliance.
Yes.
He became a great Japan-phile. So he comes at a time in Victorian England when religious doubt is at its peak, when Darwin has just been published and science is making great advances, when biblical orthodoxy and papal orthodoxy is under assault, and he finds in Buddha, a figure, not a religious figure, but an ethical figure, a man who is propagating basic ethical principles of what constitutes a good life.
Yes.
And I think the time was ripe for discovery of a personality like a Christ-like figure, so to speak.
Right.
Minus the miracles. And therefore, I think what he did through this poem, Mick, was really bring out Buddha, the man, the Buddha, the person, the Buddha, the social reformer, not Buddha, the founder of a religion, which later on came to be called Buddhism.
It's very interesting what you say about the time being right, really, for the publication of this poem, because there had been, at that time, there was a growing interest in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam, a growing interest in what we might now call comparative religion, the study of comparative religion, and that had started through people, as you say, Muller and so forth. I think personally as well, reading the poem, that the way the poem is written, it's written in a very vivid, some might say florid, but very romantic way. And I could almost imagine Victorians reading this poem and reading about the life of the Buddha. I can almost imagine this being illustrated by the pre-Raphaelite painters. Holman Hunt, of course, did a poem called The Light of the World, which is an image of Christ. And it's not too fanciful to imagine Holman Hunt having painted the light of Asia in the same sort of way. So I think the time was certainly right for Sir Edwin. But there had been Buddhist studies before. There were Buddhist academics. There were lectures in churches and so on and so forth. But why then did Arnold's poem in particular, do you think it just crystallized that moment in a very populist sort of way?
Two things, Mick. First, before Arnold, you had scholars of Buddhism. You had Rhys Davids, you had Max Muller, you had Monio Williams, then you had Alexander Cunningham, who established the Archaeological Survey of India. Earlier, you had James Prinsep, and before James Prinsep, you had William Jones, who founded the Asiatic Society when Warren Hastings was the Governor General. So you had Buddhist scholars, both in England as well as in Germany, particularly, and in France. But remember, these were Buddhist scholars. They were, translating Chinese texts, they were translating Pali texts, they were translating Japanese texts, but they were scholars, they were academics. They were writing for a small constituency of their peers. Arnold takes all this knowledge from different sources, puts it in the form of an epic poem, and the Victorian period is also the age of poetry.
Of course.
I'm struck by the number of poets who get knighted, as opposed to the number of authors. You don't have Sir Charles Dickens, but you have Lord Tennyson. You have Sir Edwin Arnold. So this was the age of poetry, which epitomized empire. It epitomized Britain in all its great glory. So I think what the first reason is what Arnold does. He takes the life of the Buddha out of the academic world and puts it into to the popular discourse, into the public domain.
Right.
But the more important reason, Mick, why this poem went viral, to speak today's language, is because it first became a sensation across the Atlantic. It was taken up by the Transcendental movement in Boston, centered around Boston. It became a sensation in America. And once it became a sensation in America, the reverse impact was felt in England. And it then became more and more popular in England. And then it got translated into German, into French. Leo Tolstoy became interested. It got translated into Russian. So then it got a continental interest. Now, in 1885, it gets translated into Bengali. For the first time, for the first Indian language, and that kindles a remarkable interest of the poem. In any case, it was a small, tiny elite, English-speaking elite of India who would read poems and books. And Edwin Arnold's poem, because it was a sensation in England, after it becoming a sensation in America, became popular in India. And so, and then the translations started coming out. And remember, we are now the nationalist movement is taking shape. Indians want to show their philosophical, their spiritual, and their cultural superiority to the British. We may be ruled by you, but we are, we have a greater civilization.
A tradition of our own, yes, a greater tradition. Yeah.
And Buddha becomes the epitome of this legacy, this spiritual legacy, this philosophical legacy, this cultural legacy. And so Buddha, all the great figures of Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda and Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi, everybody adopts Buddha as the symbol of Indian greatness, as a symbol of a person who lived in the 5th century BC, long before the Englishmen, when the popular saying, when the English were still hanging from the trees, Buddha was his message of humanity in India. So that's the second reason, Nick, why the poem becomes so very popular.
That's really interesting.
And then, of course, it keeps getting reprinted year after year after year. And also, Edwin Arnold, being the leader writer and subsequently editor of the Daily Telegraph, occupies an important position in the British establishment. He was not considered to be a great poet by any means. He was not in the Tennyson mold, for example. He was not considered to be a great poet, but because of the position that he enjoyed, and the Daily Telegraph being the preeminent newspaper, of that era, he was listened to, he was read. His opinions mattered, his opinions counted. And I think he becomes an iconic figure, over a period of time, across the continent. Certainly becomes an iconic figure in America, and becomes a hugely iconic figure in India. And I should mention here, Mick, that in 1885, Edwin Arnold translates the Bhagavad Gita into English as the song Celestial, and Gandhi, who was then a law student in London, a 20-year-old law student, becomes acquainted with the Bhagavad Gita through Edwin Arnold's translation. And it is this translation that Gandhi keeps quoting from till his very last day. He's assassinated. And till his very last day, he is quoting from Edwin Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So he becomes an iconic figure because of that.
And of course, Gandhi also spoke very admiringly of the light of Asia, as well as Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, I mean, Gandhi was more the Bhagavad Gita man. As far as light of Asia and Buddha was concerned, it was Nehru. It was Tagore, it was Vivekananda, And of course, it was Dr. Ambedkar, later on, who becomes the architect of the Indian Constitution. They become. But, in India, Mick, there are two very clear streams. There is the Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore stream, which looks at Buddha as a cultural, philosophical, ethical figure. And then there is the Ambedkar stream, which looks at Buddha as a social reformer.
Right.
The Martin Luther, if you will.
Right.
The man who reformed, who sets out to reform Hinduism, classical Hinduism. Particularly, he becomes the symbol of the anti-caste movement across the country.
But this is very interesting to me because, as you say, Buddha, partly through Arnold, but through these other figures you've mentioned, Buddha becomes recognized or elevated as a great social exemplar, a great exemplar of humanitarianism. But Buddhism does not experience a great role. Having started in India, Buddhism is more or less extirpated from India and migrates north to Tibet, to China, south to Ceylon and Asiatic countries. Buddhism does not maintain a hold in India at all. And we see this very interestingly when later on Arnold goes back to India and visits Bodh Gaya, which is the foundation stone of Buddhism, and is absolutely dismayed by when he finds that it's in the control of a mahant and all the Buddhist statuary has been turned into service of Hindu gods and so forth. Can you explain that dichotomy to me?
Well, Mick, Buddhism begins to decline in India around about the 6th century AD. And
Why is that?
The first reason why it begins to decline is the Brahmins begin to appropriate Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu, the Indian god. So, Hinduism has a remarkable capacity. Hinduism is a giant blotting paper. It absorbs everything. It assimilates everything. And the Brahmins began the process of assimilation somewhere in the 6th or the 7th century. And by the 8th century, the first inscriptions hailing Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu begin to appear. Now, so it's a gradual decline. And by the 11th or the 12th century, when Islam begins to make its advance in the subcontinent, Buddhism as a faith, really is on its last legs. It almost vanishes in India. But as you point out, this is the period when it is really flourishing in the rest of Asia. It's flourishing in Sri Lanka, it's flourishing in Burma, Japan, China, Korea, in other parts. So it's a long period of decline. It's a period of decline that begins in the 7th century, and it really begins to vanish from the Indian subcontinent by the 12th century or thereabouts. Now, the fact is that then Buddhism is forgotten till the Britishers begin to rediscover him. William Jones in the late 18th century. James Princip is the first man who really, Charles Allen has this beautiful book called The Buddha and His Sahibs, where, Charles Allen recounts the story of the rediscovery of Buddha. James Princip reads the epigraphs which have been forgotten from Ashoka's time. Alexander Cunningham, unearths Bodh Gaya and Sarnath, which are very important places in Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist faith. And then, of course, you have people like Edwin Arnold. Bodh Gaya, you mentioned Bodh Gaya. It's very important, Mick. In fact, today's Bodh Gaya owes a huge debt to Edwin Arnold, because Edwin Arnold goes to Bodh Gaya in February of 1886 and is mortified to find the site of Buddha's enlightenment under the control of Hindu priests. And along with the Ceylonese monk, activist Anagarika Dharmapala, they launch a movement for reclaiming the control of the Buddhist, the Mahabodhi temple from the Hindu priests to be handed over to the Buddhist community. to them. And since there is no Buddhist community in India, this is going to be a transnational Buddhist community. So this campaign starts in 1886. And this is resolved only in 1953. It takes 70 years, and it's a typical Indian solution that is found. The Mahabodhi temple control was taken from the Hindu priests and handed over to a management committee, 50% of whom would be Hindus, 50% of whom would be Buddhists. And that's the formula that exists even today.
Really,
so the Mahabodhi temple is a very, it's the, everybody knows what the Ayodhya, movement was, where a mosque was demolished and now a temple is being built. But before that, we had the Bodh Gaya agitation. But the Bodh Gaya agitation ended peacefully. It ended through a process of negotiation and compromise in which people like Nehru and Gandhi and, they played a very important role. But the fact that Bodh Gaya today, the Dalai Lama, for example, preaches at Bodh Gaya when he used to, now doesn't go there, but for health reasons. But the fact that Bodh Gaya today has become sort of a Vatican for the Buddhists is a very large part due to Edwin Arnold and nobody else.
And it is. I've been very fortunate, privileged to visit there myself. It's a beautiful place, and where one can truly say the spirit of the Buddha resides in Bodh Gaya. I mean, it's a completely magical place. You must have been there yourself.
Yes, I've been there, and
did you feel moved by it?
Well, Mick, one of the things that Edwin Arnold missed out in Bodh Gaya. And I think he missed out because basically, ultimately, for all his erudition and all his love for Indian culture, the Western mind is a binary mind. You're with us or you're against us. It's black or white. The Indian mind, the subcontinental mind, admits of multiple shades of gray, multiple nuances. And what Edwin Arnold missed in Bodh Gaya was that Bodh Gaya was sacred not only to the Buddhists, but it was sacred to the Hindus and the Jains as well. The point I wish to make, which I have made in the book, is that in fact, most sacred places in India are liminal in nature. When the Hindu says, this is my sacred place, you can be rest assured that it is also sacred for the Muslims, and it may have been sacred to the Buddhists and the Jains much before the Hindus came on the scene. So this liminality of sacredness, Arnold missed. So Arnold goes to Bodh Gaya in February 1886 and writes a thundering editorial for the Daily Telegraph, a dispatch from Calcutta, where he calls Bodh Gaya the Mecca of Buddhists. Now, if it was a Mecca for Buddhists, non-Buddhists would not have been allowed in Bodh Gaya, right?
That's rather unfortunate choice of phrase, isn't it?
So, by calling it the Mecca for Buddhists, and in another place he calls it the Jerusalem for Buddhists. See, I mean, Indian religions are not like the Semitic religions. There's a lot of doubt. There is a lot of flexibility. You can be a Hindu, you can be a Buddhist, you can be a Jain. The boundary, what I'm trying to get at, the boundaries are not fixed. So he missed that aspect in Bodh Gaya, but I'm glad he did what he did, because today for the Buddhist community, and there is a flourishing Buddhist community now in Bodh Gaya, as you would have noticed. It's a very important place. It's a very serene place, actually.
I think one of the things the book does, or the poem I should say does, and perhaps is another factor in the way it captured the public imagination, is that it identifies a singular figure and draws, in some instances, almost a direct correlation between the Buddha and Christ. And I think this was perhaps something that
absolutely, he wrote
could identify.
In 1891, Edwin Arnold wrote this poem called The Light of the World. And it was on the life of Christ. And that book bombed.
Yeah.
There was no appetite for a poem on the life of the Christ. That poem bombed. But The Light of Asia, of course, became, nobody remembers The Light of the World. Everybody remembers Light of Asia. But you're right. He was trying to draw a parallel between, the life of Christ and the life of Buddha. The only difference being that there are miracles in the life of Christ, but there are no miracles in the life of Buddha. So while Christ is a divine figure, Arnold makes Buddha out to be a human figure. And I think that's what led to the popularity of the poem. And that's what has led to the popularity of the translations as well. I think what Arnold does, in the light of the world, he brought out the divinity of Christ. But in the light of Asia, he brings out the humanity of Buddha. And I think by bringing out the humanity rather than the divinity, he struck a chord. In America, struck a chord in Europe, certainly in England, and he struck a chord in India.
Why do you think, and I'm just speculating wildly here, given that the poem is being published at a time where there's a growing interest in all the Asiatic religions, all of them, I mean, certainly in Hinduism and Buddhism, why was there no equivalent poem or figure or something written about Hinduism that would have captured the imagination in the same way?
Because there's no one figure, Mick.
Krishna?
There's no one figure.
Krishna?
See, remember, many of my Hindu friends will get upset if I were to say this, but Buddha is a historical figure. All the great Hindu deities are not historical deities. They're mythological figures, So there's a lot of, it sounds surreal to read the life of many of these people, of many of the gods whom we revere, including Lord Ram and so on and so forth. So Hinduism doesn't have a Buddha-like figure. Jainism has, Sikhism has, certainly Buddhism has, but Hinduism does not have a historical figure that you can relate to. And in any case, Hinduism is really a conglomeration of beliefs. So there are different traditions. Hinduism is a vast ocean into multiple traditions are converging. So to that extent, the Buddha is easier to grasp because, it's one stream. Although later on, you have Mahayana and you have Theravada and, Vajrayana, you have different Hindus. But the original Buddhist belief was a simple homogeneous belief, whereas the Hindu belief is an heterogeneous belief. I think that's much more difficult for people to grasp, and therefore, from a popular point of view, people could relate to the Buddha much more because he was, after all, he was a historical figure.
I mean, you've talked about how this book, the enormous success it was across the world and the enormous influence it had on a multitude of different people. We shouldn't forget, should we, that it was also, at the time it was published, it was met by vehement criticism from Christian missionaries and evangelists who saw this as a menace and as a danger to Christianity. Expatiate on that a little bit.
Yes, I mean, a lot of Christian missionaries, I might say Christian missionaries mostly in America, the Anglican Church was quite okay with it. Not too. They didn't get into apoplectic fits over this book or the poem. But certainly the American missionaries and some of the Scottish Presbyterian missionaries, in India, who were active then. Incidentally, Arnold was, while he was a great believer in British rule in India and the good that it brought, was dead against missionary activity. He was dead opposed to the missionaries. The missionaries didn't like him even in the period that he spent in Pune for 2.5 years. He raved and ranted against the missionaries. Yes, there was this attack on the poem from the missionaries who saw this, who saw the popularity of the Buddha as a direct threat. people started embracing Buddhism. People started believing in the Buddha, and the message that you could be a Christian and still be believing in the Buddha. That was a very subversive belief. And particularly in America, this became particularly after the World Parliament of Religions. If you remember, the first Parliament of Religions takes place in September of 1893 in Chicago, and it's around about that time that the popularity of the Buddha is becoming very, very evident, because the Japanese are Buddhists, the Thais are Buddhists, the Koreans are Buddhists, the Chinese were Buddhists. So, the Buddha was seen to be a direct threat to the supremacy of Christ and Christianity, and therefore the poem came under attack. And I think, in large part, to respond to this attack, Arnold wrote this poem, "The Light of the World," which I mentioned to you, which really bombed, which did not take off. The Light of Asia was made into a film. It was translated into 32 languages. It was adapted for opera, and so on and so forth. So The Light of the World did not have any impact whatsoever, even though it was set in the same pattern as The Light of Asia. And I think that was a period, Mick, when really it was a period of growing disenchantment with organized religion. It was a growing. A.N. Wilson has called this period the period of the extended funeral for God. And I think the most important message that Arnold sent through the poem was Buddha was not God. Buddha was not a god. Buddha was giving you a message of doing good to people, of being self-aware, and I think that resonated with people who were wanting a figure, wanting a spiritual figure, were wanting an ethical figure, but not necessarily a religious figure.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Arnold also, and obviously responding to the temper of the times and this growing almost conflict, one might say, between science and religion, drew attention to the fact that Buddhism was much more scientific than Christianity. And there's something that he said, which I'd like to read back to you. I mean, he talked about this close intellectual bond between Buddhism and modern science. And he wrote, "When Darwin shows us life passing onward and upward through a series of constantly improving forms towards the better and the best, each individual starting in a new existence with the records of bygone good and evil stamped deep and ineffaceably from the old ones, what is this again but the Buddhist doctrine of Dharma and of karma?" So this would have come as quite a shock to Christian preachers, I would imagine, and be seen as a threat that here's someone aligning the figure of the Buddha with this equally challenging notion of evolution that Darwin is proposing.
Well, when he remember that Darwin comes out just 20 years before The Light of Asia. So Darwin is very much part of the public debate in England. Part of the public debate, and Arnold, in all his public writings, his speeches, when he goes to Japan, he's a great believer in science, by the way. When he is principal of this college in Pune between 1857 and 1860, he goes into a college where only Sanskrit and Persian is taught, and he introduces courses in mathematics, he introduces courses in astronomy, and various aspects of scientific endeavor. So, although he's a poet, I think he belongs to that generation which is deeply influenced by scientific advance in the later part of the Victorian era, and he is at pains to point out that science and Buddha are not mutually exclusive, that science and Buddha are not mutually incompatible. And I think two things that he said, which I have paraphrased in the book, which said the Buddha didn't become the Buddha by following a Buddha. Buddha became the Buddha by following his instinct, by following a spirit of inquiry, spirit of questioning, a spirit of rejecting what was not right, which is ultimately what the scientific method is all about.
Of course.
And secondly, of course, the message that Arnold was conveying was the final message which Buddha conveys, to his disciples: be your own light. Don't follow a dogma. Don't follow, what is told to you, but be your own spirit, be your own lamp. So I think that's the sort of imagery that Arnold conjures up to show that science and Buddhism are not incompatible, and therefore it's not a great mystery to find that some of the greatest scientists of the 20th century have been great admirers of Buddha. India got its first Nobel Prize in Science in 1930. C.V. Raman, discovered the scattering of light, and he got the Nobel Prize in 1930. Okay. And in his Nobel Prize speech in Stockholm, Raman says that I have been influenced by 3 books in my life. The first book was by Euclid, which is the geometry, the Greek, who wrote the book on geometry, which all of us have read when we were in school. The second book that C.V. Raman says, which influenced him most, was a book by a German physicist called Helmholtz, who, sort of was a great figure of physics, German physics, in the late 19th century. And the third book, which C.V. Raman, who's just got the Nobel Prize in physics, says influenced him, was The Light of Asia by Sir Edwin Arnold. And he goes on to explain why. He goes on to say that it's because through the poem I got to, I related to this personality of the Buddha, the figure of renunciation, the figure of compassion, the figure of tolerance, the figure of questioning, the figure of understanding. I mean, he goes on to explain. And I found it absolutely, mind-boggling that a man gets a Nobel Prize, goes to Stockholm and says that one of the 3 books that has influenced me most is The Light of Asia. Similarly, there was a Russian chemist who is considered to be the father of modern chemistry, Dmitry Mendeleev. We learned the periodic table of elements in chemistry, and his son goes with Tsar Nicholas II on an Asian trip, and Mendeleev, the father, presents his son with a copy of Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia in Russian, so that he can spend his time productively reading this poem. The point I want to make is that not only some of the great authors like Tagore, Kipling, and others, T.S. Eliot, but great scientists have been drawn to the life of the Buddha. And I think that's because many of them see in Buddha a non-dogmatic, non-doctrinaire figure who is ultimately telling you, be your own guide, search for your own truth, be your own experimenter, which appeals to the scientist.
Yeah, you mentioned T.S. Eliot. I was very moved by what he said. You quote him as saying, on The Light of Asia, when I meet anyone else who has read it and liked it, I feel drawn to that person. And I mean, not just Lawrence, not just T.S. Eliot, there's D.H. Lawrence. I was amused to read even that it found its way into a Hollywood adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray, the Oscar Wilde book.
The Picture of Dorian Gray.
And a copy of the book by his painter friend Basil. There's these extraordinary resonances. Another one that particularly interested me was Joseph Campbell, who writes so wisely and beautifully about mythology and comparative religion. He's given a copy of the poem, I should say. I keep saying book, I mean poem. Copy of the poem by a young woman on an ocean-going liner returning from Europe to America. And the woman is Rosalind Williams, who is traveling with Krishnamurti.
Yes.
And of course, Krishnamurti had been brought forward by Annie Besant, who in turn was an admirer of the Light of Asia. There are all these extraordinary sort of interconnections that arise out of this one poem.
But I'm so glad you mentioned Annie Besant, Mick. She's one person who is almost forgotten today. But there was a time when Annie Besant held not only England but India enthralled, she was a remarkable figure. And one of the reasons why the Light of Asia became so popular across the world is because of the Theosophical Society. Popularized it. The Theosophical Society got it translated into languages like Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian. This was the Theosophical Society at one point of time. All the leading intellectuals of the world, the leading poets of the world, the leading scientists of the world, the leading men of letters were all Theosophists. Like once upon a time, they were all Freemasons in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Theosophy was a huge rage, Mick. And of course, people forget it. But Annie Besant plays a very, very important role in the rediscovery of Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yes.
She was president of the Indian National Congress, the party
Yep.
which I belong. She fought for India's freedom. She fell out with Gandhi later on, but she remains. Jawaharlal Nehru was a Theosophist. Nehru's father was a Theosophist. Gandhi, when he lived in London, studying law, used to go to the Theosophical Society for vegetarian food. And he writes about how he got introduced to Hinduism and Buddhism thanks to the Theosophical Society. And this is a story waiting to be written. The story of Annie Besant, the story of the Theosophical Society, and of building bridges between England and in the subcontinent, as I talked about.
Well, I think maybe you're the man to write it, Jairam. That particular story. There's one. It's a story you don't mention in the book, but might interest you about these sort of extraordinary connections that are made. You do mention Alan Bennett, who was a Theosophist,
Yes.
who then became a Buddhist and became the first Englishman actually to become a Buddhist monk in Burma. And things didn't go so well for him in Burma. He was susceptible to illness, and the place that he was living, he was having a very hard time of it. And an English woman visited him there once, and decided that she needed to raise money to get him back to England. Bennett had become interested in Buddhism, as you say, by reading The Light of Asia. The person that this English woman, Mrs. Brown, approached was Channing Arnold, who was editor of a newspaper in Rangoon, and Channing Arnold arranged for Bennett to be sent back to England. So there we have another example of this wonderful kind of circularity of the influence of Sir Edward Arnold.
I'm glad you mentioned Channing Arnold, Mick, because the last few pages of my book are devoted to the discovery of Channing Arnold's grandchildren who live in Bhopal. Channing Arnold came to Bhopal from Rangoon, married a local Muslim woman because he worked for the Nawab of Bhopal. He was murdered in 1937 over a property dispute. He had one son and one daughter. The daughter was raised as a Christian, went back to England. The son was raised as a Muslim, lived in India, and I discovered 4 grandchildren of Channing Arnold. And the one who helped me get photographs was a young man called Muhammad Michael Arnold. Muhammad Michael Arnold, who is the grandson of Channing Arnold and the great-grandson of Edwin Arnold, now living in Bhopal.
Well, what a wonderful ecumenical conjunction that conjures up.
Remarkable, absolutely. I found that mind-boggling. I discovered this through the archives. I was going through the archives, wanted to know more about Channing Arnold. Then in the National Archives, I discovered something about his murder. Then I dug deep, and then it said he was drawing a pension from Bhopal. So I put 2 and 2 together, and I said, if he's drawing a pension from Bhopal, he must have worked for the royal family. So I contacted some of my friends in Bhopal, and they, one thing led to another. It was like a detective story. And I ended up talking to Muhammad Michael Arnold, the great-grandson and in fact, Channing Arnold's granddaughter, Grace Arnold, is 94 years old and lives in London right now. So
Really? She's still alive?
she's still there. She's still there. She's 94 years old, and she's still there, very much there.
So listen, I'm getting a sort of wind-up signal here on the computer, but I must encourage you to write this book about Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating figure, Mick. She really is a fascinating figure. I've always been this whole Freemason movement in the 19th century and the Theosophical movement in the 20th century. How attractive it was. To politicians, to literary personalities, to the artistic world, is a story remaining waiting to be written. Actually,
of course, just briefly, we mentioned Theosophy. I mean, still a very, very enduring legacy of that is Olcott, and Olcott opening schools in Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, which are still flourishing. I mean, Olcott has been a very, very important figure in the Buddhist the maintenance and revival of Buddhism in Ceylon.
Well, right next to where my in Chennai, where my mother-in-law, my in-laws live, they live very close to the Theosophical Society. There's an Olcott Junior School still running, named after Olcott, Henry Steele Olcott, and of course, not to forget Madame Blavatsky, who started it all.
Right. Yeah, again, another forgotten figure, but a very fascinating woman. Listen, it's been such an enormous pleasure and privilege to talk to you, Jairam. And we've corresponded a little on email, but it's been delightful to actually to meet you, if not in person, then in sort of cyber world. And I do hope we have the opportunity to meet in person.
Thank you very much, and I'm so very grateful that you agreed. There's nobody more appropriate than you. The Daily Telegraph connection. You have written about your travels in India to all these sacred places. I've read your article on where you've been to Bodh Gaya, and there's nobody better than you to understand the significance of this book.
Well, it's a magnificent book, and I love reading it. And I would commend it to everybody who is watching this. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you very much.
We've been deeply privileged to listen to two experts, Jairam Rameshji and Mick Brown. They've been talking about Lord Buddha, but went beyond. And it was not simply a reconstruction of his life, nor even just the restoration of the reputation of Sir Edwin Arnold. It went beyond, and it went into theosophy and the need to have a book on some of the major figures in the Reformation movement, history and archaeology, and also religion. If Islam was a militant import into India, Buddhism, what is its most famous pacifist export? And it's, in a sense, sad that while Buddha himself is revered as a figure, Buddhism should have found root in the countries that surrounded India and in various parts of Southeast Asia. It's also sad that most of the monuments that we associate with the efflorescence of Buddhism are in places like Textiles and in northern Pakistan. They are still maintained, and it's a great pleasure to be able to see them. In the Lahore Museum, one of the aftermaths of 19 was that the footprints of Lord Buddha were divided. The left footprint was left in the Lahore Museum, and the right footprint was taken to the museum in Chandigarh. I hope one day there will be a time when both footprints can be seen together in a common step towards the establishment of understanding which goes beyond boundaries. So for your very sensitive, informative, and deeply moving discussion, Jairamji, I'm deeply grateful to you. and also Mick for your highly stimulating discussion on Lord Buddha. If there was ever a time, I remember meeting Ingrid Bergman, and she was performing in London. And at the end of it, like a young student, I went to the stage door for her autograph. And I said, Madam, when I was young, I'd seen you portrayed Joan of Arc, and I came that close to becoming a Roman Catholic. And she smiled very sweetly and said, I don't believe that, but thank you for the compliment. I have come close to becoming Buddhist, thanks to you, Jairamji.
Thank you.
And thanks for such a sensitive interpretation of a figure in our common history who has so much to teach us, even now, thousands of years after his death. Thank you so much indeed on behalf of the Khushan Singh Lit Fest. Deeply grateful to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jazari. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
My name is Ijazuddin, and I'd just like to welcome you to the third session of the day. And this is on Ukraine. It's titled, Ukraine has become Europe's Afghanistan. Nothing brought this into sharper focus than CNN's correspondent's spontaneous reaction on watching an exodus of fair Ukrainians crowding onto a train. But they can't be refugees, he said. Us. To discuss the causes and the possible outcome of the crisis in Ukraine, we have a distinguished and informed panel of speakers. Marcy Shaw, an associate professor of intellectual history at Yale, is the author of a number of books on post-communism East Europe, including Ukrainian Night, The Taste of Ashes, and Caviar and Ashes, which won a National Jewish Book Award. He would be accompanied by Viktoras Bakhmetyevas. Viktoras is a philosopher with an interest in the intersection of ethics and religion. He's Lithuanian by origin. Currently, Viktoras' research is focused on the philosophical problem of the concept of forgiveness that was last heard of in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The moderator for this session is Rajit Khosla, who's a lawyer by qualification, currently Senior Director of Research, Advocacy and Policy at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. He has worked with WHO in Geneva, and he was in the Ukraine recently, and so will have a first-hand insight into what is happening. So may I hand over to you, Rajat, and to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajaz, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and great to join you, Marcy and Victor, for this conversation. My journey to Ukraine started on the 28th of April when I traveled to the border town in Poland called Szymzel, and what is otherwise supposed to be a cultural center called the Ukraine House is now become a transit point for the refugees coming from Ukraine and going into Poland and to other countries in the bordering areas. It's a beautiful establishment, a period building, which is housing anything between 50 to 70 people who are constantly coming through the trains from different parts of Ukraine. What then began was a journey into Ukraine via Lviv and then ultimately to Kyiv. And what was very telling was the sheer silence that occupied us as I took that train into Kyiv. The train was almost empty. There was hardly anybody besides us in the passenger bogies that we were traveling into. But the deafening siren was accompanied by the constant air raid sirens that accompanied us through the 14 hours that the journey took us into the city of Kyiv. And I wanted to set that as the point of departure for our conversation. And Marcy, in your book, you talk about the framing of how the political becomes existential. And you start by describing the revolution that started from the Maidan in 2014 and how the lived realities of individuals got entangled in the revolution that it became, and how Maidan got to have occupied this significance in the lives of Ukrainians. And I wanted to start by therefore asking you, Marcy and Victoris, to share your own personal reflections on what you see as happening in Ukraine today. May I start with you, Marcy, first, and then we go to you, Victor?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, I should first say that I'm not a neutral observer. You know, I'm not Ukrainian. I don't come from Ukraine. I'm American. I'm an American Slavicist. But these are my friends and colleagues being slaughtered, you know, and so as full disclosure, I can't look at it with a kind of neutrality. I mean, in some sense, I feel like the world is divided fundamentally less by race or ethnicity and nationality and more by people we know personally and people we don't know personally. And when they're people you know personally, it's very hard to kind of keep any kind of a distance. What I see, you know, and what I hear from my friends who I compulsively check on is an extraordinary kind of solidarity, which was the miracle of the Maidan. I mean, what captured me about the Maidan was that it was not only a political transformation, it was an existential transformation. I was watching people change, you know, in front of me. People I had known for years were becoming different people. They were finding some things in themselves they didn't know they had. They were being pushed to the other side of fear in ways they would not have anticipated. You know, they were finding in themselves kind of reservoirs of generosity and courage they would not have expected from themselves a few months earlier. In that sense, when this war came, I knew that they would fight. I didn't know that whether or not Putin would invade, which was the question that all the journalists wanted to know, you know, especially the week or two leading up to the war. You know, what's going to happen? Is he going to invade? Is he going to invade? I had no privileged access, but I did feel certain that if he did, Ukrainians would fight. I had no military knowledge. I couldn't make any military prediction, but I understood that this was now a society that was not going to submit to living under Putin's neo-totalitarianism. And that goes for people whose stronger language is Ukrainian, people whose stronger language is Russian, that goes for people of different generations. You know, I didn't think, and I think my suspicions were right about that there was any real demographic in that country who wanted to live under Putin's fascist regime.
Thank you very much, Marcy. And indeed, it was very, very heartening to see how people changed, but they maintained their generosity even in the face of this attack on their president. Victoris, over to you. How do you see the present situation?
Well, I think, I of course I agree with everything what Marcy said, but I also think it is important to qualify this war because I think, especially in the West, but also globally, I can see a lot of people questioning the very reasons for this war. And I think it is important to say that this is a colonial war, pure and simple. This is a colonial war par excellence. This is an imperial power trying to colonize a territory which it decided that is its own. And it's, I think all our analysis and all our interpretations have to include this fact if we want to understand the logic and the dynamics of what is taking place both in Ukraine at the moment and in Russia. And I think, this maybe a little bit, unfortunately, this term empire, as an evil empire and things like that is a little bit overused as a metaphor. But I think it is important to stress that Russia is an empire in a political sense of the term. Even its setup at the moment as Russian Federation is a collection of colonies which have been submitted by the so-called titular nation. And so the Russian political mentality, if you will, and Russian definitely state mentality is an imperial mentality. And so what is happening at the moment in Ukraine is just trying to take back what they consider to be their own colony. I think there is more to that. And Marcy rightfully said, it's not just an empire, it is a fascist empire. And this qualification of fascism is extremely important. What I mean by fascism, and I recommend everyone to read Timothy Snyder's essay today in the New York Times, where he puts it very eloquently. But I think what is important here is that not all colonial powers would colonize foreign territories with a blatant attempt to deny identities or even to completely extinguish the local population. But fascists, they do. And that's what's happening now in Ukraine. Russia completely denies Ukrainian identity. It has decided for itself that Ukraine is an artificial construct, is a complete phantasm, and that is also, looking from outside, is quite difficult to understand if we disregard that this is a fascist empire which is trying to colonize a territory. And I think it is extremely important because if we disregard that, then we can it might look like some strange regional conflict of two countries or things like that. But this, I think, this we have to interpret it as a colonial war.
Thanks, Victor. And then let's come back to that point a little bit later into the conversation, also to look into a bit more deeper in terms of how other countries are looking at it and reacting to it. And what you were starting to talk about is in terms of the ongoing conflict. But if I may turn to something that you both have started talking about already, and for you to reflect further on what do you think precipitated this? So, sure, the colonist ambitions of President Putin could be very well one, and are there other factors that are into play in the sense that this conflict is being precipitated through? And should we have seen this coming? And Marcy, you, in your description of the 2014 revolution, you talk about how the revolution emerged, what it meant for the changes in lives of people, and how it built through a societal structure, that wasn't going to take it sitting down. But what happened here? Because from any stretch of imagination, this is rather unprecedented if you see from the perspective of that is an outright aggression, a violation of all the standards and norms of international law by a sitting permanent member of the Security Council. Should we have seen this coming?
As a historian, my feeling is always that everything is possible and anything is possible. A few days before the invasion, yeah, my 11-year-old son kept asking me, like, Mommy, is Putin going to invade Ukraine? Is Putin going to invade Ukraine? And I said, I don't know. It's possible. I don't know. I definitely felt like it was a decision in the hands of one man that made it especially capricious, who was becoming more and more removed from reality. When I listened to the speech that he gave on Monday, February 21st, telling the Ukrainians, oh, you want decommunization? Well, we'll show you decommunization. We'll wipe you off the map. He sounded to me, and I'm not a native Russian speaker, so take this with a grain of salt, but he sounded much more unhinged and deranged, even than he had sounded 8 years ago. If you listen to the Crimea speech, it's lies, it's false, it's manipulated, but there's a kind of shrewd cynicism in it. I mean, you feel like you're dealing with a kind of master chess player. The speech he gave a couple days before he invaded, he clearly seemed crazed and capable of anything. And the system is so vertical, that it seemed very conceivable. The decision could be in the hands of one man. Now, of course, the corollary question to that is, why does everybody else go along with it? My friend Slava Vakarchuk, who's Ukrainian rock star, and who has been incredibly brave and just incredibly good and trying to go around the country and give people hope, and shore up morale, and very committed. He called a couple days before the invasion. I don't think he'd mind my sharing this. And I said, Slava, what's the atmosphere like in Kiev? How does it feel now? And he said, well, Marcy, imagine some kind of synthesis between how it must have felt to be in Florida in October 1961 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where nobody is quite sure if a nuclear war is about to begin, and how it must have felt to be in Central Europe between the Munich Conference of 1938 and the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. He said, Kiev now feels like something like a combination of those atmospheres.
Yeah, indeed. Victor?
Well, I have to remind everyone that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, 8 years ago. It was a military invasion. It was an annexation of a large part of Ukraine, and there was a military conflict in another part of Ukraine, in Donbass, for the last 8 years. And there was a ceasefire only because Ukraine submitted to the pressure from mainly France and Germany. It was a very uneasy truce, although there were military conflict was going on. But Russia invaded not in 2022 or February 24th, but in 2014. But I also have to remind everyone that it was not the first invasion by Russia in recent history. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and Georgia, and even now, at the moment as we speak, Russian military units are in parts of Georgia. So to say that we haven't seen this coming is to say that we have not been looking. We have not been observing this region of the world. That it's as simple as that. For me, as an Eastern European, as someone who lives in this region, it is also, I have to admit, a little bit tiresome, because we are, as Eastern Europeans, used to be accused of being Russophobes and whatnot in the West. Although the only thing we have been trying to say all this time, since basically the second Chechen war, that Russia is a dangerous country, dangerous to its neighbors, and that it completely disregards human rights and both among its citizens but also abroad. Russia was killing and using chemical weapons in United Kingdom a few years ago. And so to say that we're surprised by what Russia is doing now is to say that we have not been watching at all. In that sense, I'm not surprised. I think what of course everyone is discussing is that the scale of the invasion, and of course the scale of the brutalities, the crimes against humanity and the war crimes which have been documented. They are now in the thousands. And the war has been going on not even for 3 months. This is unprecedented, even looking global in the last 100 years. I think Marcy will correct me if I'm wrong, but that I think is quite surprising because it shows a complete disregard for any norms. When to start bombing Kiev when you know that Secretary General of United Nations is visiting Kiev, and to do that blatantly is just to show that we really do not care about anything. So in that sense, of course, it is a little bit surprising, but I have to say even more surprising is even after all of this, after the Bucha massacres, after all this after blocking Ukrainian ports and basically causing food crisis in Africa, that some Western powers, and here I have to mention France and Germany and Italy, they still think how to help save Putin's face. That is really surprising to me. I mean, I really try to understand the logic of it, and I can't.
No, it is indeed logic defying, and you do raise an important point, which is about the scale of violations that we are talking about. When I was there, and in a conversation with the Prosecutor General, we were told at that point in time, which is already 2 weeks ago, that there was something in the tune of 9,600 alleged violations that they were investigating, and which is a phenomenal number to be talking about. And I would like to come back to that in a moment when and discuss with you further the idea of justice and then the idea of forgiveness and what those might mean within the context of the present conflict. But I wanted to turn to another issue, and you mentioned Bucha and the massacre in Bucha that happened. And I did visit Bucha and I did visit Bodh as well, 2 towns at the outskirts of Kiev. And as those of you who would know, these 2 towns were occupied by Russian forces for a period of time. The kind of indiscriminate attack that we witnessed in Bodh is pretty phenomenal. We are looking at over 100 housing units, buildings being completely destroyed. And one could only imagine the kind of payloads that they must be dropping at those establishments and what it means. But what I wanted to focus on is also the survivors, the victims of this conflict. And we spoke to a number of them while I was there, and we spoke to a group of men who used to live in those establishments that they were there and whose houses has been blown apart and who lost family members as a consequence of this conflict. Some lost 5, some lost 3, some 2, but everybody had lost family members in those attacks. And then there was incidents in Bucha, which were essentially extrajudicial executions, where men were essentially dragged onto the square and shot at point-blank range by the Russian forces. And there is very clear evidence to demonstrate who made these attacks and what constituted to this. And as you look at these lives that have been completely ripped apart and families of individuals who just don't know what's happening and who just don't know what will happen to them in the future because the conflict is still going on, one does struggle to understand what would justice look like? What would an idea of justice for these victims that are looking completely with blank eyes into their, what used to be their houses once, and reflecting upon what future might behold for them. And I wanted to turn to you, and both of you, as authors have talked about these issues in different contexts, is how do you see justice for these ordinary Ukrainians beyond the political theater that will happen eventually when it will happen? What would a meaningful justice approach look like? And is forgiveness even a possibility? Marcy, do you want to go on first?
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that, and I've talked to some international lawyers, and I suppose the thing that's so wrenching that we all see is that justice, if it occurs, always comes too late. It's a little bit like Hegel's Owl of Minerva. It always comes too late. I was thinking a lot about, for instance, Slavenka Drakulic's wonderful book about the war criminals from the Yugoslav wars of ethnic cleansing. She's a Croatian writer. After the war, she went and she listened to these trials in The Hague, and she wrote this book called They Would Never Hurt a Fly, with profiles and biographical profiles trying to understand how these people found themselves in this situation. And those guys, Milosevic and his people, they were tried in The Hague, but only after it was all over. It always comes too late. And I don't think in some sense there can ever be adequate justice once you've destroyed people's lives. You've taken their children, you've taken their parents. Those children are going to be traumatized, forever. Like there's no compensation, that can possibly be adequate. And the frustration then is that why, at this point in human history, are we unable to stop things in real time? Many people are asking me about the Nuremberg trials. People are asking me, because I'm a historian and normally I work on the 20th century, not on the 21st century, how is this different from the Second World War? And I said, internet, we're watching it in real time. Like, imagine it were 1942 and you could pull up one screen and get a speech by Churchill, live streamed, and another screen and, tab and get a speech by Hitler live streamed, and pull up a third tab and you can get your live stream into the gas chambers. How would that have changed what's going on? People believed at that time that the truth would save them, that if people only knew, that would be the thing that would save them. And we're watching it all in real time, or extremely close to real time. We know what's happening. We know it's an unprovoked invasion. We have more than enough detailed graphic information, and we're watching, children's hospitals be bombed, and kindergartens and maternity wards, and children buried under rubble. We're watching it in real time. Why are we so powerless in real time? And if we can talk about justice coming, but it seems like it's only coming like Hegel's Owl of Minerva. It's coming too late. It's coming when it's over. And what I'm tearing my hair about is, why can't we make it stop now?
Yeah, and no, absolutely. And I have to say, and that was coming into our conversation today, and while we were in Ukraine, one of the things that I was particularly taken aback by, how much of this war is fought both on the front lines in the south and the east of the country, but also on social media, the level of propaganda. And if you look at some of the Telegram channels that are being used to parade the graphic images of the horrors of the war, it is very stunning. But indeed, what does that mean in terms of our inability to stop what is going on, but also to develop any sense of justice? Victor, what do you make of it?
Yes, I think in situations like that, the concept of restorative justice is completely futile. It does not help here, and because we can't restore what's been taken from these people, human lives, they cannot be restored. And in that sense, of course, it's quite difficult to speak about justice in that sense. But I think on a political level, it is extremely important that those who have committed those crimes are punished, not because it will restore a previous state, or we will get back, so to speak, to point zero, but for future generations, because it will give us all a sense that we do not accept those things, that they cannot be justified. We cannot let them happen, not ontologically, so to speak. Of course, they are happening, as Mark pointed out, but we do not accept them on a level of principle. And those who have perpetrated those crimes, all of them have to be punished, and that there is this sense of justice, not in the sense of restoration, but in the sense of establishing and reaffirming the principles according to which we organize our communal living, our societies. And on a purely human level, of course, you can say that this does not help. This does not help the residents of Bucha, that some Russian soldiers or even Putin will stand trial. This does not bring them their loved ones, of course. But I think there is something that these people, at least most of them, have, is that they know that their cause is right, and they know what they are fighting for. And this is extremely important, I think, because this is the basis for hope. And so it's a question not about justice, but that those who have suffered, that all this suffering was not in vain. And that not in vain is that if Ukrainians will prevail and will create a country that they can be proud of, and that those who died for it, that they did not die in vain. And so here I would try to speak of more of in terms of hope rather than justice. And your final point about forgiveness, is forgiveness possible? I think, again, on the level of principle, forgiveness is always possible. And at least in the Western culture, we even talk about our duty to forgive. So there is this tradition of thought to think that it is not only possible to forgive, but we have to strive towards forgiveness. We have to try to forgive. It is our moral duty. So of course it is possible, and even Ukrainians speak about that. But there is, I think, a very important aspect here, is that it is too early to speak about it. It is too early to speak about it because the crime hasn't finished yet. You know what I mean? It's just that it's not the time of forgiveness. Now the time is that we have to stop this crime, which is taking place at the moment in Ukraine. And so I think I follow, and of course I know quite a lot of people in democratic Russian opposition, and I think at least some of them, I'm not generalizing, and it's vast and varied, but at least some of them, I think they exhibit this lack of sensitivity when they start speaking about forgiveness, or about future friendship of Russians and Ukrainians, or how we're gonna construct our relations when this is all finished. But I think it is lack of sensitivity, because for Ukrainians, this hypothetical is just is not just not right, but it's almost offensive, because crime is taking place now. So our all thoughts and energies should be spent not about thinking how Ukrainians will forgive us or them or whoever, but about how to stop the suffering. And then the question of forgiveness, reconciliation, and things like that will come, but their turn will come. But I don't think it is the time yet.
No, well said, Victor. And I think while we are still struggling to make sense of what is going on, and with little hope of an end in sight for this war, one is quite struck with how resilient the common person is in sight of the levels of adversity that they are confronted with. And I guess before we come to forgiveness, we need to start, as Eli Wiesel once said, by listening to each other and by trying to understand what is going on. For the few minutes that remain for our conversation, I want to talk to you a bit about the reaction to the war by those in the neighboring countries to Ukraine, but also in the rest of the world, in South Asia, for instance. And it has been a very telling experience for geopolitical thinkers, for foreign policy experts, and so on the reactions that came out. And there has been levels of generosity that one has seen within Europe, North America, that is very heartening. But at the same time, those levels of generosity has been questioned as symbolic of double standards, because where was that generosity when we did see not too far back in history refugee flows coming in and which were labeled as catastrophic by the same European governments. That being one part of the picture. Another part of the picture is how governments, whether they are in South Asia or in Africa, have reacted in the multilateral spaces to the Russian aggression. Many, if not, have abstained from voting on the resolutions calling in, whether it is calling out the aggression, about humanitarian corridors, about atrocities, have actually supported, in some cases, those things. And if you see the voting records on some of these things, it's very perplexing to understand what is going on. Of course, one is not naive. There is a lot of Russian influence in a number of countries that we are talking about, and the legacies of the non-aligned movement and so on. But I wanted to have both your take on it, onto how you see that, generosity, double standards at one end, but a complete hands-off, if not support, to the aggression on the other. Marcy, would you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, let me try to speak about what I have some sense of, because I don't have a good enough sense of what's happening through a lot of the rest of the world. I can say that spending a lot of time talking to the American media now has been very, very different from what I experienced 8 years ago during the Maidan. I was spending a lot more time, and not just me, I'm going to speak on behalf of all of us kind of American Slavicists who play the role of cultural mediators and translators and trying to help people understand one another across these borders. I spent a lot more time 8 years ago trying to explain that the Maidan was a real revolution, that it was not a neo-fascist coup, that these were not all radical right-wing nationalists who were going to go on to kill all the Jews and Russian speakers. I didn't feel like I was doing that this time. I didn't, 8 years later, having gone through the experience of Trump, American journalists understood post-truth a lot better. They understood Putin a lot better. The story about denazification, I don't think was getting any real traction outside extremely marginal groups, anywhere outside of Russia, at least anywhere that I experienced. I thought the questions I was getting from journalists were much better. They were much more sophisticated. They were much more considered. I think in general, the press coverage has been very good. I think there was a very good understanding of the fact that this was a totally unprovoked invasion, kind of grotesque, right in front of our eyes for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And there were people who also understood that, oh, the story about denazification is like the story about QAnon, and in fact, both those stories come out of the very same St. Petersburg troll factory that Peter Pomerantsev has written about. And literally, they were spun from the same people, the same trolls being employed 9 to 5 in the same corporate office in St. Petersburg. And Americans have now seen people go down that rabbit hole of QAnon. They've seen families broken up, by people who, split on the Trump issue, and they have some sense now of how that kind of manipulation and internet manipulation might be working in Russia. So I felt like there was a lot of questions about, can you get into the Russian informational space? Do Russians really believe this? But I didn't feel like I had to spend very much time at all explaining to anybody that, there was not actually a Nazi regime going on in Kiev, and that they were not massacring the native Russian speakers. And in fact, the president was a Jew who himself is a native Russian speaker, who has given incredibly well-pitched and heartbreakingly wrenching, speeches and addresses in Russian to Russian soldiers, and to Russian families. And so I feel like the understanding has generally been good among politicians, among journalists, among students. I've also been very moved. I mean, I'm in a kind of privileged position because I get to teach students from all over the world. I got an email from a student from Mexico I taught several years ago, who had been in a seminar on Arendt with a student from India, a student from Russia, one from Ukraine. He read about Ukraine in my seminar, and he wrote to me and he's like, Marcy, we've been out of touch for several years, but I want you to know that I'm now in Berlin and I'm driving medical supplies to the Ukrainian border every week. I got an email from a young man in Argentina who I'd never met, but who had read the Ukrainian Night and earlier written to me about, how interesting he found Ukraine and how he liked the book. And he wrote to me after the invasion and said, Dear Professor Shore, I'm so sorry to bother you. I know you must have no time at all, but I keep thinking about those people in the book. And could you just tell me, like, is Misha Martinenko okay? And what about his little sister? She must be 18 years old now. And this is a young man in Argentina on the other side of the world who's never been to Ukraine, who just read this book, but who is, reading and who is thinking. And I've been moved by my students who had nothing previously to do with this part of the world, who have volunteered, who have raised money. And so I can't complain about that. I also think that for a lot of Americans, having come a hair's breadth from our own fascist coup, just a little over a year earlier, gave us some understanding of how easily that could happen. And one analogy I used is that, okay, imagine January 6th had gone the other way, which it very well might have gone the other way, and we were living under a Trumpist fascist dictatorship, and Trump decides that making America great again, means, going and invading Canada. And while Canada is also a bilingual country and lots of people speak English there, Toronto is an English-speaking city. What if the American army under Trump showed up and started shelling Toronto and bombing kindergartens? Well, lots of people have family on both sides of the border. Lots of people in Washington have cousins in Philadelphia. They're also native English speakers. Gee, why would they have a problem with that? Why wouldn't they be part of this great America? They're all English speakers too. And I think having gone through that experience and having been so close, to our own country slipping into that neo-totalitarianism has given Americans some greater level of empathy for what's happening in Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Marcy. Victor?
Yeah, I also maybe I'm not an expert in this, but maybe I can share a few impressions. If we speak about the region in which I live, Lithuania and the Baltic states, I think here it's just for us, it's very simple. Ukraine is fighting our war, as simple as that. And so, and it transpires to all levels of society, to political elites, no matter left or right. Of course, there are some voices, but they are really marginal. But I think there is a broad consensus that Ukraine is fighting not just a just war, but also it's defending us from an imperial power, which is just trying to. And if Russia prevails there, then we'll be next in line. It's as simple as that. Also, I think maybe with some exceptions, but broadly, I think the same sentiment applies to all the countries of so-called Central Eastern Europe, all those who were once behind the Iron Curtain, who have in living memory experience of living in one form or another under the rule from Moscow. Of course, Hungary is an obvious exception to that, but all the others are more or less clear of what's taking place in Ukraine, and that we have to do everything that is in our power that Russia does not win, not only for Ukraine but also for the whole region. I think if we talk about the United States, I think their reaction is, I would call it, evolving. I think although in the beginning United States and Washington were sharing intelligence with Ukrainians, but they were quite reluctant to help militarily. I think there was some doubt if Ukraine will be able to defend itself. But I think after the first few days, when it became clear that Ukrainians are fighting, they're not escaping, I think the admirable stance of the president of Ukraine helped in that regard, but also the whole of the nation. And I think then United States and United Kingdom became quite active in supporting both financially and militarily Ukraine, and I think that is a very positive development. What is quite disappointing is I would call a slow and tentative reaction of the big powers in the EU, France and Germany first and foremost, Italy to some extent. And I think they're sending mixed signals. I'm talking here, of course, of the political elites, because all the polls show that populations in these countries are in favor of helping Ukraine much more than their governments do at the moment. But their governments are sending quite mixed signals, sometimes saying that we should be helping Ukraine, and actually indeed saying that we are helping, and then it turns out that they don't, and keeping some back channels, talking to Moscow, finding for some reason a priority to save Putin's face and things like that. And that is quite disconcerting, and I think it should be disconcerting globally, because this sets a very worrying precedent. If you can invade any country, commit war crimes, commit crimes against humanity, and countries like France and Germany will be worried how to save the aggressor's face. I think all so-called lesser or smaller countries in the world should be worried. And I in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. So I think this is, I'm not sure if the leaders of those countries understand that these things will stay in the memories, that the world is observing this, and I think they making a grave mistake. Hopefully this will change. If I would have to characterize in one sentence what's taking place, I would say that Eastern Europe and United States of America see as their priority for Ukraine to win, while I think countries like Germany or France, they want the war to end. And these goals are not the same. They are not the same, and I think here there is some differences. But I would like to stress that I think that all the world who cares about the rule of law, all the world, everyone in the world who cares about human rights, about international law, I think they should insist that Ukraine has to win. That there can't be any frozen conflict of the sorts that we already have in Georgia, that we had in Ukraine since 2014, because this only encourages the aggressor. I think we have to be very, very clear about it.
Thanks for that picture. We're almost out of time, but I do
Marcy wanted to add something.
Yes, no, I was going to come to that as well, but what I wanted to say was, and then to maybe have a final minute of reflection from both of you, if and I know future is hard to predict and we don't know what's happening, but if I may ask you for a brief reflection on what would give you hope from where you are sitting right now. Marcy, to you first, and then we end with you, Victor. Thank you. Marcy.
Okay, so yes, first I would say that I completely agree with Victor. We're not in a saving face situation. I mean, we're dealing with a sociopath. We're not dealing with a rational actor. Political scientists like to assume that people will act rationally. I mean, historians know that history is just drenched with examples of people acting irrationally. You know, we've watched Putin level Grozny, level Aleppo, you know, now Kharkiv and Mariupol. I think it has to be decisive. He has to be gone. That regime has to fall. Ukraine has to win decisively. It's not a let's negotiate type of situation. What gives me hope, and what I constantly say to my children who know entirely too much about what's going on and have been to Ukraine and know our friends and students there, what I try to get them to focus on are the thousands, if not millions of people who have stepped up to help. You know, people like the young man in Argentina and my student in Mexico, you know, and this young man that I know in New Haven who flew to Poland from one day to the next to help translate and evacuate pediatric cancer patients. All of these people around the world, some of whom, all the pediatric oncologists who have come to help those evacuated kids and place them in hospitals. What I try to tell my kids is that I really think there are more good people than bad people. You know, I really think the number of people who are trying to help save people is greater than the number of people who are slaughtering and torturing people. Unfortunately, that handful of psychopathic sadists like Putin seems to be holding the rest of us hostage. But what gives me hope is I think there is so much. There's so many people trying to do good in the world that I like to think we're going to find a way to let that prevail ultimately.
Thanks a lot, Marcy. Victor.
Well, I don't deal in hope. I'm trying always to talk in plans. So I'm sorry about that. But I think if we talk about this particular conflict, I apply the formula which of one Russian opposition figure. He says that Ukraine has already won. It's just that Russia hasn't lost yet. And I think that's the situation at the moment. I think Ukraine already has won on a broader scale. And so the question is now the terms of Russia's loss. And so in that sense, I think it's quite hopeful. But if we speak broader, and we should speak broader beyond this conflict, I think the question is that I would like to end with what I started. I think the problem is that Russia is still an empire. We had in 20th century, we had a few projects of de-imperialization. We had some voluntary ones like United Kingdom and France after they lost heavily some colonial wars and they understood that this is not the way. And we had some de-imperialization projects which were done against the world. That's Germany and Japan. So we have some precedents in history how to de-imperialize a state. Russia has never been de-imperialized, and I think that's one of the mistakes. So we have to apply all the colonial experiences on colonial studies and post-colonial studies and think about Russia in those terms. And I think that that's a very, very fruitful area, both of research, but also of political practices.
Thank you so much, Victor and Marcy. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for joining for this very, very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on the Ukraine night, and it was moderated by Rajat brilliantly, and it had two eminent speakers, each of whom has provided very moving insights into the current situation in Ukraine. Marcy, if I may just for a second pick up on something which was in your book, A Taste of Ashes, where you talked about, you said nearly a quarter century after the fall of communism, the Ukrainian revolution illuminated anew the border between modernity and post-modernity. And you've identified that post-modernity began with the relinquishing of attempts to replace God. Not only God was dead, but moreover, there was no one and nothing to replace it. It reminded me of G.K. Chesterton's famous remark that when man ceases to believe in God, the danger is not that he will believe in nothing, but that he will believe in anything. And if I may, you've cautioned Marcy about totalitarianism, and there are numerous examples, Trump notwithstanding. And if I may just refer, Victor, to your assertion and insistence that the Russian position at the moment is one of a revival, a renaissance, if you like, of imperialism. The Russians never stopped being an empire. It is just that they camouflage their ambitions more subtly. You've mentioned that empire as such is back. And I'm reminded of a remark that was made by Chairman Mao Zedong. André Malraux, at that time, the French cultural minister, went to Beijing, and he asked Chairman Mao, do you see yourself as the last of the Chinese emperors? To which Mao Zedong replied, but of course. And one is tempted to suggest that if one was to ask Vladimir Putin, do you see yourself as the next revival of the Tsars? He'd certainly reply, but of course, I am the new Tsar. And it is this which frightens all countries, that regardless of their size, regardless of their political beliefs, etc., but which believe in the supremacy of law, in the foundations of sovereignty, and who are, whether they're strong or weak, it doesn't matter. What matters is they exist, and they have the right to exist. And that is really what is being flouted at the moment with this, invasion. One is tempted to wonder whether the Russians will retreat as they did in Afghanistan and leave Ukraine and return to Russia as they had to do then. But thank you, all three of you, for a very stimulating discussion. And on behalf of the Kushan Singh Literary Festival, let me thank you and the listeners for participating in this extremely timely and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've had a most stimulating series of presentations being made today, and I'm sure that all of you will join me in thanking the Kushan Singh Litfest management, but particularly Rahul Singh and Nilüfer Mourya, who performed yet another miracle of technology and cooperation across the world between countries, friends, and persons who share a common ideal, and that was that crossing boundaries is really the way forward. I'll just introduce a few of these that will be presented. The first will be the author Jeffrey Archer, who will be interviewed by Mihir Bose, and it is on his book Over My Dead Body. It's his new thriller, and it deals with continents and ocean liners. The second session will be by Wendy Doniger with Arshia Sattar, and it is an American girl in India, and it's her autobiography as a younger Wendy falling in love with India. The third session will be by Anjum Altaf and Amit Basol, with Raza Mead as the moderator. And they'll be talking about Ghalib. And this session will bring together from both sides of the border lovers of Mirza Ghalib, a favorite of Khushwant Singh, of anyone to whom love is the only four-lettered word that matters in life. The conclusion will be a thank you session by Rahul Singh, in which he'll be winding down with gratitude and shaking hands across borders. We look forward to tomorrow's session. Please join us then.